As we begin to near the end of this overview series looking at the Marvel Famous Covers line from ToyBiz, I will start to turn my attention to those oddities, the characters that don't quite belong to a specific team or family of characters. But speaking of families, first of all I will take a look at Marvel's first family, the Fantastic Four releases that we got as part of this line. Sadly, a full roster of Fantastic Four members was never fully produced. We only got a Mr. Fantastic and Invisible Woman, but we did at least get Doctor Doom. So without further ado, let's take a look at the Mr. Fantastic and Invisible Woman exclusive to Target set. As we can see, this was a limited edition, limited to just 12,000 pieces. We've already seen a couple of these exclusive double packs before in this series, but they essentially take the same design elements that we see in the single figures and they've just expanded it and made this elongated long box, which is still very nicely designed. We have those wonderful illustrations there of the characters, and in the centre we have the comic book. Now, I am still a huge fan of this approach, but I have to say the illustration here, particularly for the Reed Richards, is a little bit off. It's not as strong as some of the others we've seen in this line. The famous cover they've gone for is Fantastic Four #3, and I think, to be fair, any of these early issues would be credible as a famous cover since they have all become really iconic, but I do think that this is a really dynamic cover and definitely worthy of being the famous cover for this set. Meanwhile, the reverse of the packaging has two colourful illustrations of the main characters. I think these look pretty good. They do display them both with their powers, and there's a little bit of bio in the centre there. So I think this is very presentable and looks pretty nice on display. The front flaps, of course, open outwards in that gatefold presentation, so we have two inner flaps here with those illustrations recycled from the outer packaging, and we have a little bit more bio about these characters. Meanwhile, in the centre of the packaging we have that wonderful window display, and we can see these characters in all their glory. So let's start with Mr. Fantastic. I think the first thing that will grab you about the figure is how vivid and bright this blue of his costume is, which is really colourful and fun. Sadly, it all seems to be downhill from there. First up, we have the sculpt, which, if this looks familiar to you, there's very good reason for that, because it is in fact a recycled sculpt that we've seen before on the Spider-Man release. And to be honest, it's not a very good sculpt in the first place. His head seems to be leaning to the side, and for some reason they have him looking up and to the left, and consequently he always looks slightly strange. They have at least made the effort to try and distinguish him from the Peter Parker head by giving him his trademark grey at the temples, which is a nice effort, but it just doesn't work with this sculpt. Sadly, the proportions of the body also seem a little bit too gangly and a little bit too gawky with that head, which looks a little undersized. Then we have the body stocking itself, which is all one piece, and as I said, the material they've used is very nice to the touch. It's a very bright, vivid blue colour, and it catches the light very, very nicely. I think they've done a really nice job of this, but sadly the 4 logo in the centre of the chest there just looks ever so slightly too small. But on the other hand, one thing that I can say in its favour is that they at least have given him faux leather boots, which works much better than some of those clunky rubber boots that we've seen on some of the other figures. So this is definitely a vast improvement, but because it is made from that faux leather, there is a danger that over time this will start to flake and come away. In terms of articulation, he does of course have the standard articulation scheme that we see at pretty much all of these figures. He has the straight swivel at the head, so he can spin his head from side to side or right the way around if you want him to. He's got the fantastic ball joints that allow the arms to kick all the way up and all the way back there, which is great. There's a single jointed elbow allowing it to bend to roughly 90 degrees, and then there's a pin swivel at the wrist allowing that wrist to rotate 360 degrees and of course hinge forwards and backwards as well. There's a ball joint at the waist allowing the figure to rotate from side to side, to lean from left to right, or to spin from left to right as well, which is fantastic. Then of course there is a ball joint in the hips as well, allowing the legs to kick out to the side, kick forwards, backwards, and there is a single jointed knee as well, bending that knee to roughly 90 degrees. And then finally there is another pin swivel which we can get some use out of at the ankle there, allowing the foot to turn from side to side and hinge forwards and backwards. Overall, this figure is something of a disappointment. I'm a big fan of Mr. Fantastic, and I don't think he's been particularly well served here. There's no hint at all of him having any powers. They haven't given him any accessories that he can stretch, and that's okay. I don't necessarily need that. But I must admit, I am absolutely crushed that they've decided to recycle this head sculpt, which just looks odd anyway. Doesn't look anything like Reed Richards. It's far too young, and it just, yeah, having that expression looking off to the left there just looks really strange. And then sadly, it just doesn't fit the rest of the body, so it looks a little bit too small and just makes the whole figure feel a little bit gawky and a bit silly and out of proportion. So let's take a look at the Invisible Woman and see if she fares any better. Well, she does have the same outfit, so again, very bright and colourful, which is a really good start. And they do seem to have given her a brand new head sculpt, so this is different to any other figures that we've seen so far on some of the female characters in this line. But sadly, it's just, once again, not quite right. There's something about this that just doesn't look like Sue Storm, and I think it really chiefly comes down to the eyes, which seem too big and just too piercing. These seem especially egregious because they just seem to contrast so starkly against the very small nose and small lips, so it just looks really strange and a little bit off-putting. You'll also notice that it opted to give her real hair as well. And as we've seen from previous releases in this line, this can be very much hit or miss. Now at first glance, this seems to work okay in the main, but as you can see over time the hair is very likely to get quite wiry, get out of control and start to look a little bit like a tangled mess, so you have to really look after this. And unfortunately, whilst it doesn't look bad per se, it definitely doesn't look all it could be. It just looks a little bit unkempt and a little bit clunky. The tailoring on the costume works pretty well, it fits quite nicely all in all, and it's made from the same materials we saw on the Mr. Fantastic figure. So again, very bright, very colourful, and looks really good. Particularly when you put the characters next to each other, we have that uniform feel, which is pretty cool. But just as with Mr. Fantastic, I'm not a huge fan of the 4 logo in the centre of the chest. Just looks a little bit too small for my liking. Also, her hands, which are the standard female hands that we've seen on many of these figures so far, do seem to be a little bit too large here. They're a little bit distracting. And if you look closely, the faux leather that's been used on the belt there is already starting to wear away and it's starting to flake off, which is pretty disappointing. At the bottom of the legs we can see that faux leather again that straps right around the moulded plastic of the foot, which is a heel, but it looks pretty good. This is disguised quite neatly and I think this is pretty effective. Now, as we've seen, they are liable to flake over time, which won't be such a good appearance, but when they're brand new out of the box like this, then they look pretty decent here. In terms of articulation, the only real difference with this figure, as we see with the female figures in this line, is that they do have much better articulation in the head because they have that ball joint that allows the head to look up and down and side to side. Once again, I'm left with a feeling of disappointment with this figure. Whilst the costume is very nicely produced all in all, the figure itself just doesn't really quite come together. The hands just look a little bit too big for some reason, just out of proportion, a little bit monstrously large, and then the head, like I said, it's all about that profile really and that sculpt, and those eyes are just too wide, too big, and just overall there's a feeling this figure just looks really stern, and it just doesn't feel right. Okay, and then finally for today we have Doctor Doom, and of course Doctor Doom is one of the most popular, most famous villains in the entire Marvel universe, so I'm really glad that we managed to get him as part of this lineup. This cover illustration is absolutely fantastic. I really love this image. I think it's very beautifully painted, and it definitely has caught the spirit of Doctor Doom there. That mad intensity is pretty ferocious and really striking, so really love this cover. I think they've done a really nice job. In terms of the famous cover, they've gone for the Fantastic Four number 5, and given the fact that it is of course the first appearance of Doctor Doom in the Marvel universe, I think that definitely ends its status as the famous cover for this character. But to be fair, over the years we've had no shortage of very famous, very eligible famous covers for this character. Sadly, the back of the box is dedicated to that mail-away exclusive Aunt May figure, which I've covered many times in this series, so you'll know my thoughts on this. And of course, when we open that gatefold cover there, we have 2 of those fantastic images in the inside flap there, a little bit of bio about Doctor Doom, and then on the right hand side we have the window display showing the figure off, which looks really nice and perfect for putting on display. Sadly though, things do start to go downhill when we release him from his packaging. The first thing that struck me was just how bulky this figure is, and there's definitely something a little bit squashed and ill-fitting when it comes to the tailoring. Now, the head sculpt itself isn't bad, but the scaling and the proportions of the rest of the costume are definitely out of sync here. This mainly comes down to the cloak being a little bit too tight and padded and not giving enough material to be able to let this sit comfortably around his shoulders. And also it's not helped by those big giant buttons that we see at the top there, which are far too huge. Whilst the hood by comparison feels too small and a little bit too snug to his face. This is a shame though, because as I said, the sculpt itself is actually quite nicely done and it's quite detailed and it's actually quite effective. But when we look at the torso, again, we are distracted by the tailoring. Now, it is nice that they've got different materials here, and they've used very nice materials. Definitely has a lot of different textures going on in this figure. The cape, for example, has 2 layers to it. It has its outer layer, and then it has this inner lining, which is made of this more metallic, lighter, sort of silky material, which looks really good. They've used that for the tunic as well, which is nice. It catches the light really, really nicely and very effectively, and it looks very nice. But unfortunately, the body underneath it is just too bulky, and the outer cloak is just not big enough to accommodate this extra bulk. So as a consequence, he looks really constricted and a little bit strange, which is a real shame because they have gone to that effort to give him that separate tunic underneath, which I do think is a really nice touch. And of course, they've given him that rubber belt there as well with the gun holster, although it's non-functioning sadly. But it's nice to see this belt run through the rings on the tunic. So if you're wondering why this figure is so bulky, well, that's because for the most part they've used this very, very thick rubber to create the armor effect on this figure. Now underneath there is an endoskeleton, which is effectively the same as any of the base mold figures that we see in this line. And if we look carefully, we can see that in between the gaps there, we can see that endoskeleton underneath. Now, this is ToyBiz being experimental and not being 100% successful, sadly, because on the one hand, it does work quite nicely in terms of aesthetic, because obviously when you use the articulation of this figure, there are no seams, there are no bends, we see no unseemly joints, which is great, but unfortunately, he can't hold any position. If you want to bend the arm and keep him in that position, it's not going to happen because the rubber's going to force it to snap back into its rest position. And sadly, you're also left with this thick rubber outer coating, which just makes the whole figure look out of proportion and a little bit too thick and a little bit too clumsy, so none of it really quite fits together quite nicely in terms of its tailoring, and even causes great difficulty for this figure to be able to stand independently. Ultimately, Doctor Doom is probably the biggest disappointment in this line. He's one of the most highly anticipated characters, and sadly, it just doesn't work. Which is a real shame because I do believe they put a lot of effort into this to try and make him one of the premier releases in the entire line. It's just really unfortunate that this particular experimentation didn't work out. And so there you have it. Ultimately, all of these figures are slightly disappointing in their own way, and it's such a shame because they're such fantastic characters, and it's really nice that we do have them in the line, but everything about it just seems to just fail to miss the mark, really. First off, of course, we don't have a full lineup of Fantastic Four characters. It's a real shame that we never got a Human Torch. I think that would have been relatively simple to bring to the 8-inch line. Obviously, the Thing presents a lot of different challenges in his own way, but it could have been managed. And whilst the Doctor Doom is experimental but just falls shy of its ambition, there's really no excuse for Mr. Fantastic and the Invisible Woman, which it does feel because this is a Target exclusive, like they've just kind of cobbled it together as an afterthought, which is a real shame and slightly disrespectful to these characters. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like and remember to subscribe as there'll be plenty more videos soon.